D'accord. I'm going to give you a little story about some applications of, dynamic epistemic logic, the area of logic of knowledge and change of knowledge, into distributed computing. To point out the difference mainly between these two areas is that dynamic epistemic logic is the logic of incorporating new information. This is a bit like how I suppose Vincent also presented the systems of propositional logic, where you might change some information where it is implicit that it comes from outside, right? It's just something externally given. So dynamic epistemic logic is merely a modal logical generalization of such procedures of knowledge, of belief-based revision. However, in distributed computing, this is about agents informing each other, sending messages, receiving messages. This is an entirely different paradigm. And this clashes a bit with the idea of having a closed system where new information comes from outside. But there are ways to combine one and the other, and I want to present you some ways to make this combination. I will not present this in great detail, but sketch some approaches, mainly by way of examples, how you can do such things. However, to at least start with something very familiar from dynamic epistemic logic, this is an example of what is known as the logic of public announcements, the logic of incorporating new information that can be described in a formula. So let us imagine that we have two agents, N and Bill, and N knows that this is all very recent, indeed, factual information, that there is a Christmas tree on Place Stanislas in Nancy, which has indeed just been erected last weekend. And the other information is that Bill knows whether Q, so Bill knows that Q is true or that Q is false, where Q is that Saint Nicolas has arrived in Nancy. Oui, c'est bien contesté par une autre ville, Saint-Nicolas-de-Port, qui ont déposé une plainte juridique, puisque ville de Saint-Nicolas, c'est pas Nancy, mais c'est Nicolas-de-Port. So this is really relevant, new facts, and people might worry about or wonder whether they are true or false. So according to them, this is false. The real Saint-Nicolas is in Saint-Nicolas-de-Port. But as a system, we can model this as follows. We have 4 states. I simply write the value of the atoms P and Q as the name of the states, where overline means false. And here A is uncertain between Q and not Q, but A knows that P is false. And here A knows that P is true. Here B knows that Q is false. Here B knows that Q is true. So it's a way to represent that B knows whether Q and A knows whether P. Okay, I will use this model a lot. If it's not clear, tell me now and I will explain it. But what now happens, they are informed that P or Q is true. So from the 4 valuations, 1 disappears. And that is the resulting model. As this is a logic of, in which we want to express knowledge, one of the typical things you could, for example, say here, that here the uncertainty for B has removed. So B now knows that P is true. Here B was uncertain about that. But N is uncertain between B having that knowledge or B being ignorant. So this is a typical transformation in dynamic epistemic logic from a given model to a different model by some kind of dynamic operation where new information comes into the system, P or Q is true, and then in the new model we can make new calculations on what is known or not known. Let me already point out here the typical characteristic of this dynamic epistemic logic. These relations, they might still be seen as, relations within a model, as you might know from modal logic in general. This is an arrow, but it's not an arrow in a model, it's an arrow connecting models. So the idea is that we have, instead of internal transitions in a model, we have actually transitions between models. So it's sort of modal accessibility on a higher level. Yeah, there's a story to talk this into the same level again, and I will give a bit of that story. Okay, given that, you might, well, wish to make this more general towards the direction of distributed computing in very different possible ways. For example, what I just gave is an example of one action where you have one model, and as a result of that action, you have one updated model. Of course, we could have different consecutive actions, sequences of actions, such that we have a model that is transformed into an update, into a further update prime. Or with a different action into update double prime, and yet another action into update triple prime. And as we are interested in what agents know, it may be that an agent is uncertain whether only this action took place or whether these two actions took place. So an agent may be uncertain between the blue updated models. This is problematic because it compares sequences of actions, histories of different length. Okay, so this is one issue that one may investigate. Secondly, the previous example I gave was some kind of abstraction. I said, okay, let P or Q become known, and then the agents incorporate that information. Well, did they receive it at the same time? What reason did we have to assume that this was the case? Should we not look at a more fine-grained analysis where sending of this action is different from receiving that action? Okay, this sort of thing is, you might say, extremely, well, obvious from a perspective of distributed computing, but very non-obvious from, well, the perspective of the modal logics in which I am working. So this would be a novel thing to do in that setting. And I will present you an example of that. Well, thirdly, there are a number of actions, such as the typical cases of lifting pianos with several people, where you need to combine several actions in order to obtain one given effect. You cannot do them in some order. No, you have to really do them concurrently, simultaneously. So is there some analog in the logic of knowledge wherein you can only get a resulting model if you do some actions concurrently? And I will also give an example of that. Okay. The examples I will give, and I will give some theory, but mainly examples, are something on, well, a non-public communication with a weak signal, something I know as the riddle of the 100 prisoners and a light bulb, but there are many other such examples. A bit on gossip protocols, protocol epistemic, on which I will give only very little information, but on which I will talk in much greater detail on Monday in the Lyrica seminar. And something on simplicial complexes, well, an area that I have recently started to investigate with some people in Paris. And then I will say a bit about a logic wherein you can separate sending from receiving information. And then a bit on this concurrency example. Okay. And I'll try to do this all in 45 minutes. Yeah. To prepare the ground for the story when I want to compare well, sequences of actions of different length, I will mainly point out that there are some works in my area of business, wherein people thought that asynchrony is not possible in dynamic epistemic logic. You can only compare sequences of actions if they have the same length. I will not explain this in detail, but what principles would you need in order only to be able to compare sequences of the same length? Well, obviously the one that is known as synchronicity in temporal logics, which says that if you have an alpha and beta, so alpha and beta will stand for sequences in this presentation and sequences of actions, sequences of events. If you have two sequences that have the same length. Then there is one that is known as perfect recall. That is, if you have a sequence alpha followed by an action E, or a sequence beta by action F, then they are indistinguishable for an agent A. Well, if they are indistinguishable for an agent A, then alpha and beta were already indistinguishable. In the word perfect recall comes from looking at the contrapositive of this principle. It says that if they were different, then even if you execute new things in both situations, then they still remain different. So you can recall, you can remember that they were different. Yeah? Then there's something called no miracles, which is a bit harder to explain, but the no miracles, the deus ex machina, it really means what it says. So that you cannot suddenly, if you have things that you cannot tell apart, be able to distinguish between them. That is not supposed to happen. And yeah, okay. There was another publication that said, well, actually, we can give different modeling, and then that makes it very compatible to have a comparison of sequences of actions of different length. And the main difference in that different modeling is that you have to actually use the more traditional axiom for perfect recall that is known as the Amir-Prueli notion of perfect recall. This is the standard temporal epistemic logic, which says that, well, if we have two sequences alpha followed by an action E and a sequence beta, then if you take off E, of alpha with E, there should be some subsequence of beta that is indistinguishable from alpha. So if we have two sequences here, and they are the same for an agent, then if we take a bit off from one sequence, then it should be possible to take a bit off of the other sequence, and they're again indistinguishable. Okay, so they propose a way to make, after all, an interpretation possible of dynamic epistemic logic for asynchronous processes. Well, instead of delving deeper into the technicalities of this comparison, which I find interesting, but this paper is not very well known. It should be more well known. So instead of that, let me continue with some examples. One of the reasons that this fascinating paper didn't become well known is that one of the authors then worked for Google, and he was the main author actually of that publication, and Andreas Witzel, Google New York. Yeah, he must have worked there 10 years by now. So he's probably and surely a millionaire, but he no longer works in dynamic epistemic logic, unfortunately. Yes. Okay. This is the first example. Consider a situation where you have a room. It could be the coffee room on the side here. So in the coffee room there is, well, maybe there's a light bulb or there's a switch of the coffee machine. And people walk past here all the time, right? But you can't see who they are. So what can happen? That somebody turns on or off the switch of the coffee machine, the light bulb here. And a simplification we have of three agents, 0, 1, and 2. They can not only, each of them, switch on and off this light bulb, but they can communicate by way of that. Because they will, in some unknown schedule, be going all the time to the coffee room to see whether the light is on or off. And if so, they can decide to change the switch. What is 0 allowed to do? Well, he turns off the light when he sees that it's on. And only that. If it's off, he doesn't do anything. But if it's on, he turns it off. What do 1 and 2 do? Well, they turn the light on if it's off, but they only do this the first time they see this being off. Now, there are many different schedules in which they may enter this isolated secret room, right? And we cannot see who has been going in and out and at what time this is happening. So this is an asynchronous system. There's no notion of time. If I'm 0 and I'm waiting to be going to that room, it may be that I'm the first who will enter the room and I see that the light is off. And well, then it may be that I was the third person going into that room, and all the time I'm seeing that it's off, but I don't notice. However, if 1 or 2 comes in that room, they turn on the light. So the value of P is the proposition representing the state of the light. The value of P becomes from off on. And I also, for sake of the modeling, have 2 additional variables, Q1 and Q2, that state whether in the past 1 or 2 turned on that light. So because 1 turns on the light, it then becomes true. And this remains false. So we have this transition. If agent or prisoner 2 is doing that, P becomes true, Q2 becomes true, but Q1 remains false. If 0 is coming into the room, he does nothing. So it stays off. Everything remains false. Why is this asynchronous? Well, because 0 doesn't know whether this or this has already taken place, because he doesn't know whether anyone has been going to the room, or whether this still is the case where everything is false. You might say this is the sequence where nothing happened. This is the sequence where one thing happened. So I represent this as this action is indistinguishable from that action and is indistinguishable from the empty sequence. Agreed? Okay, so therefore this is a comparison of histories of unequal length, because these have length 1, 1, 0. And this is a problem in the things I do, in the dynamic epistemic logic. Okay. How can we repair this? Replace the sequence, the empty sequence where nothing happened, by a virtual action standing for nothing happened. E epsilon, the red one on the right hand side. Add this action in your execution tree. And indeed, nothing happened because all these things are still false. Now we say that on this level, after one action happened, agent 0 cannot distinguish this from this from this. Why is this a good thing? Well, because P is true here and P is true here, but P is false there. And 0 cannot distinguish these 3 states. We assume that this link is transitive. So it represents that 0 doesn't know whether P. 0 considers possible that the light is on and the light is off. Okay, so this is what we want to happen, because 0 doesn't know if 1 or 2 have already been in the room. However, here we achieve this on the same level 1 in the execution tree. And here on the left-hand side in blue, we need to compare 2 different levels of the execution tree. So it's a way to transform, you might say, an execution tree modeling asynchronous behavior into an execution tree modeling synchronous behavior. Well, here the hoping that at least the example comes through. Here the technical part of this example then stops, but given this transformation into something where you can look at things on a given level, then it can be modeled straightforwardly in dynamic epistemic logic. So from a modeling perspective, the red part is the solution and the left part was the problem. Yeah. Okay, having done that, does this, you might say, properly address the problem of asynchrony in dynamic epistemic logic. No, it does not. It addresses properly the problem for this particular example. But not in general, and in general it does not address this properly, because even if you might say cut out having to compare level 0 from level 1, maybe you have to compare level 1 to level 2 of the execution tree. And an example of that are the gossip protocols. Who is familiar with gossip protocols? Okay. The example I started out with, the public announcement logic, it's information that is publicly available to all agents in the system. If there are 10, they all learn simultaneously at the same time what the information is. Gossip protocol is a way of information exchange that is not public to all agents in the system. And indeed, you can think of calls, of telephone calls. If there are 10 agents, 2 of the 10 agents are making a telephone call, but maybe the remaining 8 do not know whether this call takes place. This is even the standard situation. Again, this might be happening in other rooms of the building, and even if you know that these people are there, you do not know whether this event actually takes place. So this is a more problematic form of information exchange from the point of view of, trying to measure how much more the different agents got to know from this action. In particular, if we have a simplified presentation of this telephone call problem is where each agent has one item of information that it wants to share with everybody else, where it is known how many agents there are, and where the goal of the information exchange is that all agents get to know all secrets. So in case there are 4 agents, A, B, C, D, and in case the information that A, B, C, and D know is in capitals, say the proposition capital A, capital B, capital C, capital D, then the goal is that they all get to know these A, B, C, D bits of information. They can do this by calling each other, and when they call each other, they take the union of both their sets of secrets, both their sets of information. So this should be a B. Starting out in a situation where everybody knows a single secret, simply separated by dots. This is not a history, but this just represents a set. Then if A and B call each other, they both know A knows 2 secrets and B knows 2 secrets. Then if B and C call each other, B has 2 secrets, C has 1 secret, so they all 3 know 3 secrets, and so on. Yeah? In a tree where only do the first step, this A-B call, given the situation where they individually know a single secret, after A-B, A and B have 2 secrets, after A-C, A and C have 2 secrets, and after B-C, B and C have 2 secrets. Now, D doesn't occur here, here, and here. So if we imagine from these 4 agents, D being, in another room, then even if D knows there are only 4 of us in the building, D doesn't know which of 3 calls took place. So again, there's some uncertainty for D between these calls. And just as in the previous example, we could try to model this uncertainty by adding another node in the tree corresponding to nothing happens, where a node call took place, and again everybody knows a single secret. And that would avoid us the trouble of having to compare this level to that level. However, in this case, there may be further calls between A, B, and C that do not involve agent D, such as this call, after which they get to know even more secrets. So, as D is still not involved in the call BC, D should also be unable to distinguish this from this distribution of secrets. And this distribution of secrets would only appear in a lower level of this execution tree. So we would still have to compare different levels of the computation of the execution tree. So we are still not excused from having to model some an asynchrony in the form of comparing histories of actions of different length. In this case, it will be histories of calls of different length. Okay, so this does not, so it's more a way to try to convince you that this does not solve the problem of how to model comparing, of how to model asynchrony in dynamic epistemic logic. There are still some things that you can learn from this experiment. So partially it's indeed experiments, but partially it's already results in progress or obtained by me or by collaborators or by others. There are still some results. One of the results would be that if you look at the history alpha and the consequences of executing this sequence and then verifying whether formula phi is true or false. So the square bracketed alpha phi stands for after executing alpha, phi is true. Then those will be the same consequences as after the sequence execute alpha and then do nothing. Then phi will still be true, and if it was false, phi will still be false. So in some attempt to axiomatize these systems, that would be, a derivable theorem. And this is useful. That is one thing. Another thing that is useful is that once you start to compare histories, one of the issues is, of course, that action histories may be, finite, but arbitrarily large. So you're comparing a set of alternatives that may be infinite. Once you have that in an axiomization, then you're sunk, because then you have an infinite conjunction of possibilities that you have to consider. There are also ways to address that, such that you might say get finitary representations of infinite execution trees. And in such cases, you can, after all, bound the number of alternative histories that you have to consider to a finite set. And then an axiom that, has this shape becomes possible. And that is useful. Some work wherein such an axiom appears is this and this. One is by Christoph Abt and Dominique Wojciak on some recently published work in the Journal of AI Research, and with my collaborators Wiebe van der Hoek and Löwe Kuijer, I also have some sort of system wherein such a form of axiom appears. But some people here and there are working on such issues in the setting of gossip protocols. However, if you look more at and actually what I didn't say, these solutions are actually not solutions in the logic of knowledge and knowledge change. They are not solutions in dynamic epistemic logic, but they're solutions in PDL, more well-known action logic. If you're more looking for solutions in dynamic epistemic logic, then here are some works wherein this appears. And the one I want to point out is by Malvin Gattinger. He was a PhD student in Amsterdam, where he, in his PhD thesis, is a chapter on modeling gossip protocols in dynamic epistemic logic. Yeah. Okay. So much for gossip. Then a very different way to compare histories of different length is comes straight out of distributed computing. And this part of the story, I already see I'm running out of time enormously, but I will adjust in due time. In a way, I'm going to talk a bit about the PhD work of Jérémy Ledent, who is currently a PhD student with Eric Goubault, École Polytechnique. And he has done some fabulous work that was, partially published at GandALF, one of the conferences in the area. And I got to know about this because I got to know Sergio Rajsbaum in Mexico, who, actually it was a collaboration between Eijck Goubault and Sergio Rajsbaum, and Jeremy is one of the PhD students who became involved in this project. So the idea is that obviously, in asynchronous computation, synchronization is problematic in distributed computing. But there's a way you can, come close to synchronization, which is called a snapshot. If at some moment during the execution of a number of concurrent processes, if at any moment the agents want to know what the status quo is more or less of their efforts to perform some computation, they do a snapshot. And there are different ways to model snapshots, but one of the ways is called immediate snapshot, and that means that the agents communicate by way of a shared memory location. How do they communicate? Well, they read and write. Or rather, they write and read. They drop what they know on the memory, and they read what is currently on that memory. And all these processes try to do this at the same time, but of course they fail because it's an asynchronous process. But some of them may still do it at the same time. What can we have? Well, take in a way what we can have is any partition of the processes into sets. So given 3 agents, A, B, C, it can be that A does it first, then B, and then C. It can be that A does it first, and then B and C do it at the same time. This is what the notation here means. It can be that A, B, and C do it all at the same time. Then you strike it lucky. That's synchronization. It can be that B does it first, and then A, and then C, and so on. What happens? Well, take this one. If A does it first, then A drops his information and gets all the information that is on the memory device. That's only for A. Well, bad luck. Then A is unaware of B doing it afterwards and only then C, or B and C doing it at the same time. So A cannot distinguish these two schedules. We could also have the same schedules, but look at the perspective for B. What does B do here? B writes his information, he reads what's on the memory device. That's already A, but now also B. So B writes his information and gets off what A and B have done. But not of C, because C was later. However, here B and C do it at the same time. They don't know this, but when B now reads the information, A, B, and C's information is all there. So B gets more information from this than from this. Agree? So therefore, this appears different to B than that. That's why I say that they are different. Okay, so we get some partition on this set of all possible schedules from the perspective of A, and from the perspective of B, and from the perspective of C. Okay, I didn't explain this, but we are now back in the territory of dynamic epistemic logic, because if we're talking of partitions given partially observed information, that's dynamic epistemic logic. So we can do this in dynamic epistemic logic. Okay, that's nice, but dynamic epistemic logic, that was supposed to do only synchronous stuff, not asynchronous stuff. So how come we can still do it here? Well, we can still do it here because we do not compare the individual events in these histories. We only compare the outcome of the entire sequence and what happens or what is true and false at the end. And that is like, because it's an approximation of synchronicity, that we can compare on one level. If we were to look inside these schedules into what is called the different concurrency classes, well, yeah, then it becomes problematic, and we have also to compare histories of different length. Because this is length 3, and this is length 1, and this is length 2. Okay, so in short, there is a way to do this. Is this useful? Yes. It is useful because we could similarly do this for other settings, like the gossip protocols I presented. For example, if you're only interested in one particular epistemic goal relative to the execution of such protocols. For example, if you're only interested in terminating call sequences, no matter what their length is. And I suppose you could similarly model quite a number of features in other distributed computing applications on condition that you focus on features that, well, have to do with gathering actions in rounds of events. So yeah, there are various ways to make more or less synchronous cuts in asynchronous systems. Okay. Here I call this a gold mine for Dell applications. So indeed, let's see some gold. Why do I say this? Well, again, here I will not say much, but so this PhD work of Jeremy Ledent, they're doing some very interesting things. They're transforming Kripke models into what their, you might say, favorite semantic primitive is, namely simplicial complex. A geometric primitive of knowledge representation that is ubiquitous in distributed computing. And it so happens that for Kripke models with certain properties, you can transform them into simplicial complexes and vice versa. I will not prove this, but let me prove this by example, because I love giving an example. And let's take the example, well, the model that we have already seen. Well, in that case, let me take the next picture. This is the model and the transformation that we have already seen. However, I added a little bit in red to make it clearer. The red things are the names of the states. I cheated a bit because I gave the states the names of the name of the state was the valuation, right? But if you formally, really formally in crypto semantics, the states are abstract names, and it so happens to be that atoms are true or false in this state. But let's now add these names. Why is this nice? Well, in a Kripke model, the points are the states. The labels of the points are the states, and the labels of the links are the agents. In a simplicial complex, the labels of the points are the agents, and the labels of the links are the states. Isn't that a nice duality? So how does this work? Well, this state becomes this link. This agent becomes this point, and this agent becomes this point. So here we have you might say, a state having an A link and a B link, and here we have a state link linking an A point and a B point. This duality is possible because we're talking about Kripke models that have an aspect of what is known as locality. Locality means that the variables that the agents are uncertain about, they are always known by some agent. This was the case here. A knows the truth about P, and B knows the truth about Q. And the node that has the label A here, we also give the value of what A knows about this variable, namely that A knows that P is false, and here that B knows that Q is false. So this state linking these two nodes is still the state representing that P is false and Q is false, like here, but just differently. Does this make sense? Okay. Now, what was the transition? Well, the transition consisted of removing a state. So here the transition means removing a link. That's all. It's, well, I find, well, when I first got to know this about a year ago, I found this fascinating because, well, it's a different perspective on something you know very well, where you can do exactly the same. Well, or maybe. Well, in fact, you can do exactly the same because there are more complex operations in dynamic epistemic logic, where the transformation is not relative to a formula, but where the transformation is relative to a structure that looks like a Kripke model, particularly for non-public information exchange. And then that structure, as it looks like a Kripke model, the resulting structure is actually a modal product of this structure and this structure. And just as the, well, you might say taking the modal product of two Kripke models delivers another Kripke model, the modal, well, not the modal, but the product of two simplicial complexes delivers another simplicial complex. So there's a lot of duality between these approaches. And they have shown that duality. So let me shift that. This is another example of a simplicial complex. And this is yet another example which I want to give, but let me just give the results. The first item says that if you have Kripke models that satisfy some additional properties, there's a one-to-one categorical correspondence with simplicial complexes. The second item says, and this also holds for, well, Kripke models that represent dynamic features in such a logic. The third item that says that, and the crucial operation of calculating the new information state from a given information state, which is a modal product, also corresponds to a product operation between simplicial models. Okay, so, and on both, in both settings, we can therefore define a logic of knowledge. And that is, well, almost doing the completely the same thing. There are some tricky issues with bisimulation there that the authors did not address, but I'm actually trying to collaborate with them on these issues, and given that they have define this framework, there are many other things that epistemic logicians usually do that you can also do in distributed computing, like indeed define bisimulation between structures, or like defining common knowledge as an infinitary notion that, defined using individual knowledge, or having distributed knowledge. So there are many more things you can do. And it seems you can obtain then many new and other results there. Okay. You have to imagine how much work it was for me to draw all these pictures in ticks. Yeah, except this one. This one I robbed from Jeremy's PhD thesis, because fortunately I'm the rapporteur. So I have a pre-publication version which had this figure on page 110, and I didn't ask his permission yet to use this figure, but it saved me time preparing this talk. Yeah. Okay. How much time do I have, Giuseppe?
When we started?
10 minutes. 10 minutes plus.
10 minutes. Okay.
10 minutes?
10 minutes.
Past 13, so we should still have 15 minutes.
Okay, 15 minutes. Been so long.
Okay. Pas de problème. Okay. This was one topic. I promised you another topic, namely the distinguishing sending from receiving messages in logics of knowledge. So let me get to that next topic. And to introduce it in the same way again, let's again look at the example I already gave, where new information comes into the system from some external source that is not so clear, and then everybody incorporates that information. Well, it is synchronously, simultaneously. It's a public, what's known as a public announcement. And then there's a lot of cognitive processing assumptions that you make there, and then bang, you are there. But the advantage is that the operation corresponds to a model restriction, and that's, of course, well, a very known and well-studied feature in first-order logics that you can similarly use very well in modal logics. Okay, so, but let's now try to be more detailed. New information comes into the system. P or Q is true. But let us now give it the semantics more of a PDL test, in case you were familiar with that. So it's still a model restriction, but we're not assuming anything about the agents receiving that. So there's still something ruled out. But then A receives this information and then B receives this information, and well, just to, because I didn't know what otherwise to give there, let's just draw the same picture there and we will see what happens. But now we have three different aspects of this action. It's being sent, A receives it, B receives it. Of course, it could be that it's being sent, B receives it, A receives it. Or it could be being sent and A receives it and B doesn't receive it. So there are many different things that could happen. Now, one thing I did not explain is that in the logic of public announcement, like the previous slide, where we treat this sort of thing, a well-known action looks like this. Let me paraphrase the meaning of this. And instead of K for knowledge, I write B for belief. There's a reason for that. It says that after public announcement, agent A believes psi. If and only if, on condition that phi is true, the formula of the public announcement, agent A believes that after public announcement of phi, psi. So this is a modality for which we have the square brackets of the necessity type. This is a modality for which we write B for belief, but they're both necessity type of modalities. So this axiom says that we can commute these modalities on condition of the execution of the first one. So as modal logical axioms go, this is a fairly natural action. Okay, now I'm presenting a new logic wherein sending and receiving of actions is different. So this modality will mean something different in the new setting than in the old setting. And here we require for A or B to know something that they have received this information. So what is the principle going to look like now? Well, after sending the information phi, and after A receiving it, A knows or believes some piece of information psi. Well, again, if on condition that the information was true, A believes, well, that this postcondition psi was true no matter how, no matter the different ways that it could have been received by others that were outside his field of vision. So what was possible? Well, just A received it, or first A and then B received it, or first B and then A received it. So we expect some such principle to come out of this new logic. So this well represents that A can only be sure of some postcondition of receiving some information if this postcondition is ensured no matter in what other order or absent order the other agents receive this. And this is the case for two agents. Okay, Then comes a technical part that I will do a lot quicker. There is a way in which you can draw nice execution trees, which I will not explain. So let me just move on. It was again a lot of effort in ticks, as you may imagine, but it provides more a temporal epistemic representation of what here I do in dynamic epistemic logic. And in temporal logics of time and knowledge, time are internal arrows in larger structures. Let me just stick to that as an explanation. The assumptions in this logic will be that announcements are sent by the environment. Okay, we've seen that. Announcements are then received by the agent, but they are individually received by the agents. Okay, we have seen that. Announcements are true when they are sent. In fact, we have also seen that because it still means that the truth of the announcement is a precondition for the commutation of the operator. Then there are two things that we have not seen. Announcements are being received in the order in which they were sent. That doesn't have to be, but it's a simplifying assumption that makes it, technically easier or more general or at least less general, but at least it provides a technical solution for the semantics. The other thing is that announced agents assume that others receive at most as many of the new information that they have received themselves. So they reason about the past, but not about the future. This is a bit contrary to what is usual in distributed computing, where you want to compare histories of arbitrary length, even if they are longer than what you currently know of. Having this setting, what sort of things may happen? Well, look at this history. I don't separate the items by dots here. P is being sent. P is being sent. B receives it. That means that B knows P, right? So now the information can be given, truthfully, that B knows that P. Then A receives that information. Okay, that's a possible scenario. Now compare this to this one. P is being sent. Then B knows P is being sent, then B receives the first announcement, and then A the rest. This is not a possible scenario because in order for this to be true, B must have received it first. So given these sequences of actions and with interleaved with agents receiving them, not all these orderings are felicitous. Not all these orderings are possible. So you need some notion to compare them. One more example. P is being sent. B receives it. So then B knows P. A hasn't received it yet. So A doesn't yet know that B knows P. So here we have that B knows P, but that A actually believes that B doesn't know P. This means that our modalities do not satisfy the principle that what you know is true. B not BP doesn't imply not BP, no, because we have BP. So it's a logic of belief and not of knowledge. Okay, let me stick to that to explain the behavior of the modalities. Having said all that, you can have a language for that, wherein we have the operators we have all seen. Give a syntax and semantics for that, which I will not explain. And even give a complete axiomatization, wherein this is a derived principle, which I started out with to motivate what you can do in this logic. Yeah? And then this axiomatization can be compared to the more familiar axiomatization of public announcement logic that I have not explained here and will not explain. So that then you can compare this asynchronous dynamic epistemic logic to a dynamic epistemic logic that, other people in the area are familiar with. So we can do new things in this logic. However, might we wish to do even more in that logic? There are some publications on that, or near publications. One by Sophia Knight, Bastien Maubert, and François Schwarzentruber, that has recently seen the light in mathematical structures for computer science, and one by me and Philippe Balbiani and Saul Fernandez Gonzalez in Toulouse, that in some previous version was presented at the workshop Strategic Reasoning, but currently is somewhere on the submission. And Saul is Philippe's PhD student, and he's currently involved in developing fabulous further generalizations of these ideas. One very obvious generalization is that you consider synchronization for arbitrary subgroups of a group of agents. So in public announcement logic, all agents together receive it at the same time. In asynchronous announcement logic, the agents receive it individually. Well, but you could consider logics where in given 10 agents, 3 agents receive it at the same time. Subgroup synchronization. So instead of in the red part, instead of an after individual A phi, we can have after subgroup B phi, the primitive of receiving information. So the asynchronous announcement logic is the case where we replace the red B by a blue small a. And the public announcement logic is the case wherein the sending information is always immediately followed by reception of information by all agents. So in this case it becomes like a linguistic fragment of a more general logic with the BNF in the first line. This is not quite the case, but nearly so, and that is an interesting story. We just submitted this yesterday to Eijck. I'm curiously to find out. You're not supposed to disclose this because it can be rejected, and then you all know that I have rejected submission to Eijck, but I don't care. Yeah. And there are many more generalizations of this. So this is another big story, which is the end of this story. And in the remaining -5 minutes, let me just say this. Surely you all have heard of the muddy children problem. And even if you say no, I'm not going to explain it. But there's something very funny in standard analysis of the muddy children problem. Because there's this action of, if you do not know whether you're muddy, you're not stepping forward, right? And then there's the action of everybody, no person stepping forward, no child stepping forward. And if you have 3 children, there's like 3 children not stepping forward because none of them know whether they are muddy. In the standard analysis, this is modeled as the conjunction of 3 preconditions standing for 1 doesn't know whether he's muddy, 2 doesn't know whether he's muddy, and 3 doesn't know whether she's muddy. But why should this be a conjunction? It's a concurrent action. Because they concurrently do not step forward, and that defines the action. So we need more detailed, more fine-grained analysis of even such very basic phenomena in an epistemic logic that involve concurrency. Okay, thank you. That was my talk.
Is there any question for us?
I have a question about the correspondence between simplicial complexes and epistemic logic. So we can see the correspondence at when the dimension is low. You gave some example, but I was wondering in higher dimension, how are the correspondences?
The correspondence is for any dimension. So given any number of agents, the correspondence is given. And the other example I gave was for dimension 2, for 3 agents, but the correspondence is for any dimension, and the way they do this is it's a correspondence between the frames, and then they derive properties of the models where you add valuations.
So are there some direct correspondence between some results, topological results in simplicial complexes, like say Sperner lemma, in terms of epistemic?
Yes. Well, no, let me not. I had the subdivision example somewhere hidden in the slides. I forgot. There's something specific you can say about how Sperner's lemma corresponds to an operation you can do in dynamic epistemic logic. And I forgot what it exactly was. So there are some other things you can say about these correspondence that obviously have to do about connectivity, which is very similarly treated in dynamic epistemic logic. But because in simplicial geometry, you tend to focus far more on higher dimensional features, which you do not do in that way in Kripke semantics. There are more parallels to be made that have not been considered in Kripke semantics. Yeah. Yes, so there was one particular thing about Sperner's lemma that could be said about Kripke semantics, but I forgot. Yeah. And this becomes more interesting, I think, but here I'm a bit speculating. If you consider fixed point modalities like common knowledge and distributed knowledge, because Sperner's lemma is also a fixed point property. So there's probably lots of interesting things to find out. And I think currently, Goubault and his collaborators have only started to, if I may presume, to touch the surface of all the results you could get out of there. I think there's much more to be gotten out there. Yeah.
Many questions that we have a chance to
Give me one.
Okay, so let's try again, Hans.